Hello, I'm Rob Russell, and I'm your instructor for American Lit 1. I'm going to go through a short introductory lecture to give you a sense of what the lectures will be like in the course, and some of this material may show up on your first quiz as well. All right. First off, I want to talk a little bit about what we think of when we think of American literature. Of course, I think I mentioned this in the welcome. We could define it as literature written in the part of North America that becomes the United States of America. But in a broader sense, when we're talking about American literature, we're talking about the literature of America that is, at least in historical terms, recent. So the past 400 years. Modern in the sense that it was almost all of it created during the age of printing press, and in a lot of ways it is an international literature. It's not specific to a particular race or ethnic group or a particular language group, although it very much privileges the English language, and as a result, of course, the English settlers who made up such a large number of the European colonists of the first, the 13 original colonies who became the original states. And this is in contrast to European and classical literature, which when we think of that as older and ancient and pre-modern, written for the most part, prior to the invention of the printing press and widespread literacy, and very much homogeneous. Think of German literature and French literature and Spanish literature, whereas American literature is a polyglot of a lot of different traditions put together. American literature does have some challenges for modern readers, and this is something that you're going to experience fairly early on in some of the writers that we tackle, such as John Smith and Roger Williams, Mary Rowlandson. They use unfamiliar or archaic language, words and phrases in English for the most part that we don't have anymore, or that we don't use the same way anymore. In some of this, especially in John Smith, you'll see non-standard spelling and punctuation. It will be sometimes hard to make it through a sentence without stopping a couple of times and figuring out what exactly is going on here. And along with that comes some strange stylistic choices. For example, John Smith, in his writing in the General History, he is writing a narrative that's based on his personal experiences, but he writes about it in the third person. So he writes about Captain John Smith doing this or doing that. Captain Smith did this. Captain Smith did that. Whereas he actually is John Smith. But he uses the third person to try to demonstrate some objectivity in his writing, rather than it, just being I did this, I said this, John Smith did this. And in a lot of ways, that was a sort of a false conceit, and it is confusing. But just be aware that these things will come up, and we can, I'll answer any questions about those sorts of things in the discussion boards if you do have any confusion. There's also the importance of the historical context and the intended audience. Of course, you're reading this way out of the historical context, hundreds of years later. So a lot of times I have to frame, and the introductory material in the textbook will also frame the literature that we read within the historical moment. What was going on at this time? What is happening? What are the significant problems facing William Bradford or John Winthrop or Anne Bradstreet in their lives? What do we need to know about what they were doing and where they came from to be able to understand their literature the same way that someone from their time would understand it? And also, there's the problem of sometimes what we read wasn't intended to be public writing. Um, for instance, we'll be reading some journals and diaries, which were, not necessarily intended to be things that people hundreds of years from then were going to be able to read. We're going to be reading some poetry and things that were written with no intention of ever being shared. So that will present some problems as well, because there will be maybe some confusion about context, and so we'll go into maybe some of the biographies of the authors to help you understand a little bit more where they're coming from. The roots of what we call American literature can be looked at as, in a lot of ways, kind of like displaced roots, because when we talk about American literature, we're almost always talking about the literature of the Europeans who colonized North America, which, of course, North America already contained people that had distinct cultures and languages and political systems, rituals, and oral literatures that, in many ways, are now lost. We have a few pieces that were handed down through the oral tradition that do show up in our textbook. And this does make it, it's difficult then. We can't really reconstruct the full literature of the people that were here before us. And I say before us because, I am of European descent. Probably, most of us, if we do have any Native American in us, it's very little in this day and age, especially in this part of the country. So when we think of American literature, we really are looking at the literature of the Europeans, and starting off at least with their contact with the indigenous peoples. And so that's when we look at the roots of American lit, we're looking at particular conflicts, such as conflicts between the colonists and the indigenous peoples, the Native Americans who were already here, colonists and the land, their survival. What did they have to do to be able to survive? How did they deal with the environments that they found themselves in that were so different from where they had come? Which at that time, Europe was very agrarian, but was also very well established. That you had roads, and you had systems of currency, and you had all these things that really had to be established in the New World. And I say the New World; it was a new world for the Europeans. It wasn't for the Native Americans who were already here. The conflicts between the colonists and their own home countries and cultures. One of the reasons that European colonists came to North America was to be able to, for instance, practice religion the way that they wanted to, which was in some ways, and depending on where they were from, might be illegal where they were from. For instance, with the Pilgrims, with the Separatists, and in some cases with the Puritans as well, who wanted to purify the church. They wanted to practice a version of Christianity, of the Church of England's Christianity, that was much different than what was being done in the High Church. And we'll talk more about that. But they were definitely in conflict with some of the ideas from their own culture. And also conflicts between the colonists and themselves, their own interpretations of things. You get a bunch of people that want to go to a new place to experiment and live life in a new way. A lot of times they have very strong opinions about those things, and we see that from the very earliest literature of people being conflicted over how they interpreted everything from how to worship, what the Bible says, to do we have any right to be here on this land? If we have a charter from the King of England, the King of England doesn't own this land, the native people own this land. So we see that with Roger Williams and John Winthrop fairly early on. And those conflicts expand into larger themes in literature that we're going to see played out over the course of the semester. Some of those themes are capitalism versus communalism. with the Massachusetts Bay Colony, with the Plymouth Colony. Those were very much communal societies where everyone worked together. But they soon expanded into more mercantile societies where capitalism, merchant capitalism, was the way of doing things in England and in most of Europe. So you get some clashes there. Civil law versus natural law. Do we need to have law and order? Do we need to have a constitution? Do we need to have rules on the books, or can we follow the law of God or follow our conscience? And there's some people who write about that. John Winthrop is one who was one of the leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, who writes about the importance of both civil law and natural law and how there needs to be a balance. Individuality versus conformity is a common theme that comes up very early on as well when we see people like Roger Williams, who dissented against some of the things that John Winthrop wanted to do, and others of the Massachusetts Bay Colony who, because they could not conform, were asked to leave or shut out of the colony. Private self versus public self. We see that in many of the writers that we read early on, especially the poets who wrote basically for themselves or a small group, and were not planning on being, public with their innermost thoughts, and how that changes when it does become public. Democracy versus oligarchy. We see that later on with people like Henry David Thoreau and Frederick Douglass and others when we get into more political philosophy. That also goes along with racism versus egalitarianism, where we have a white ruling class that from very early on sees itself as superior because of its English heritage or because of its race. And later on, we get to see sort of the idea of egalitarianism, of equality, of universal equality, becoming what we think of when we think of America. We see that idea develop over time. And we also see the conflict that occurs between certainty and ambiguity. This idea of knowing what God wants, knowing what your mission in life is, knowing that you are, let's say if you're a Puritan, you know that you're of the elect, you know that you're saved, versus ambiguity, uncertainty, not being sure of what your role is, not being sure of what your purpose is. And really, art and literature, there's a struggle throughout American literature between sort of the literature of the certain and the literature of those who see life in a more ambiguous way. And it's interesting to see how some great art can be woven out of uncertainty, whereas also some inspiring work can be written out of certainty as well. And the Europeans, what did they bring? What did they bring to the table with all this? Of course, they brought their languages. We look mainly at what we're reading is in English, but there was Spanish, there was German, there was the Indian languages that gave us place names, etc. But primarily we have the European languages. We have their ideas about history. That history is a linear process that leads towards something. And you see this a lot in the writings of the Puritans too, is that there's an idea of history being a playing out of God's will, right? That what is happening is, we are working through history to to meet a larger purpose. And for John Winthrop and the Massachusetts Bay Puritans, it was to build this shining example, this city on a hill. They brought their ideas about class and order. They believed in, if not necessarily aristocracy, they believed in an idea that there were classes of people, that there were people who were destined to rule and people who were to be ruled, whether that had to do with who your father was or what the color of your skin was or what gender you were. They brought their religions, and there was a multiplicity of religions. We mainly look at the Massachusetts Bay Puritans and the Plymouth Pilgrims, but there were also other Protestant sects that came over, Quakers, for instance, later in Baptists who came over and Methodists who came over. So, and then later we get Catholics, and we get sort of a larger melting pot of European religions mixing together. And of course, they brought their book, the Bible, which becomes something that is really kind of, even though it's not an American book by any means, it's the bedrock of a lot of American literature. So much of American literature refers back to the Bible because it is at that time it was, sort of the universal book that, all of the European colonists were aware of. And there were multiple versions of that book, not just what we consider now, I guess, the King James Version of the Bible is sort of the standard Protestant version of the Bible. There were many other English translations of the Bible at that time, some that were a lot simpler and more straightforward. Some of them might be arguably even more accurate as far as translations go. But principally, they had the Bible, and that was something that bound them together, and also bound in a lot of ways our literature, because that was something that could be referred to and alluded to that most people would understand. The results of all this, of these conflicts developing into these themes, combined with what the Europeans brought with them, is that we get new interpretations of ideas in the New World. We get new interpretations of religion and faith and things like democracy. We get new myths that are created to define this new experience. Things like, the Pocahontas story, or fictions like Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle, or The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And we get the creation of a new history, and in some ways the end of an old history. The arrival of the European colonists coincided with massive disease throughout the Native American population. So we lose about 90% of the Native American population at the time that the European colonists are arriving. In conclusion, I want to say that I hope you guys enjoy this course. I'll try to be a little bit more concise and together in future lectures. I just wanted to get through this one and give you guys a little bit of a sampling and just a little bit of information to help you be prepared for the first readings that we do starting next week. So anyway, I hope you guys have a great week, and I will look forward to reading about you in your introductions online. Thank you.